I'm curious as to what you think about the true unemployment rate. We've seen the unemployment rate go down and down and down over the last few years, but you hear people talk about government policies that are leading to more part-time employment. We hear about discouraged workers. And so maybe the employment picture isn't as good as we think. We aren't seeing any real wage growth. And so maybe, Ron, you could start talking about what you think the real employment picture is.
Yeah, I believe that as you said, the numbers really don't tell the whole story. It looks nice when you see a national rate of 5%, which is what I believe it currently is. And you add in the discouraged workers and those who have a part-time job, who'd rather have a full-time job, things like this. It is considerably higher. And as a result, the employment picture is very different, really, than what the numbers say. And as a result, that also accounts for some of the weakness and the slack that occurs in the labor market and so on, because the numbers aren't telling the whole story.
Other thoughts? Do you agree?
Yeah, basically, is this working? Okay, I guess if I turn it on, it'll work. Yeah. The underemployment rate, is that any better?
Not much.
Okay, how about now?
Good.
Okay, the underemployment rates just broke 10. It's down to 9.8%. It needs to be below 8 before you can have any meaningful issues. The other thing that I don't know how to quantify is the number of people who've dropped out of the labor force. It seems to be disproportionately high. It's not just baby boomers retiring. I'm wondering if we haven't created an England here where we've created a permanent underclass on welfare that aren't going to go back to work, at least not for quite a while. And the bottom line is that wage rates don't lie. If there was really no slack in the labor markets, you'd see it in wage rates, and you haven't.
Yes, that's true. In fact, the labor force participation rate, you go out to the BLS, and you can look this up. It's down about 3 percentage points overall since the recession started. But if you look at the core group from 25 to 54 years old, those people should be working. They shouldn't be retired. That rate has fallen by 2 percentage points as well. So that means people have dropped out of the labor force. They're no longer counted as unemployed. And so the rate looks pretty good in that respect. But it masks those kinds of changes that I think are really not good indicators of our economy.
So what does that say about the prospects for economic growth and economic health? First, let's talk nationally, and then let's talk in Arizona.
I think we're going to have slow growth. I think that continues. And discouraged workers will slowly come back, but I don't know how many, because I don't know how many are, again, permanently out. And I'd be very surprised to see, other than in certain areas and construction markets, I'd be surprised over the next year to see much pressure on labor rates, on wage rates.
Yeah, no doubt that the growth will continue to be slow. But I think one of the ways to try and get around that is, as I mentioned in my previous speech, to try and make it easier for business to proceed. That is, there are just too many impediments out there right now, I think, in terms of instilling business confidence. You know, the regulations that you face and the other types of just day-to-day business activities are not instilling the sufficient confidence. And it goes beyond just the U.S. and what I think the government is doing here, but weakness in the international economy, uncertainty about what to expect in the future, all kinds of things that can make a person nervous when they want to decide whether or not they need to invest a few $1 million on something which might make it better. And as long as the investment isn't occurring, the unemployment rate isn't going to get any better.
I'd agree. An economist by the name of Robert Higgs coined a phrase called regime uncertainty to explain the Great Depression and why it lasted so long. And part of it is that businesses don't know what the future is going to hold. You know, are you going to incur a lot of cost if you decide to hire a lot of workers that you can't plan for now? And that causes them to be a little bit slow to react. I looked up some of the investment figures yesterday, in fact, and the net fixed investment, the most recent figures are about 40% lower than they were before the recession. So we don't see a pickup in that investment, as Ron mentioned, and part of it is probably due to the uncertainty of the future, and a lot of that is just a result of the political process and what kind of rules and regulations are going to come along and disrupt those plans.
Let's explore the political process a little bit. And Elliot, I was really glad to see you pick on Russian literature majors rather than philosophy majors who have been taking a big hit recently. So we've got a presidential election looming. Does it matter who gets elected? To the economy.
In terms of general trend, even Ronald Reagan couldn't change the trend. He delayed it momentarily, but even he couldn't change it. And he was probably the last president to run for office who actually had a point of view, in my opinion. But
He was wrong, but he did have a point of view.
Well, I think Ronald Reagan's only error is he thought if you starved the Congress of money, they wouldn't spend, and they spent anyway, which is essentially what got us in this whole and continue. But suffice it to say that it's a question of which evil you're going to have. Are you going to do it quickly or are you going to do it slowly? And but I think that if you're anybody who believes we're going to go back to the way things were and we're going to have rapid growth again with the regulatory issues, with tax issues, and I agree. The only thing I agree on, Ron, is corporate income tax is crazy. You're double taxing everything. Just get rid of it. I just don't see how the United States gets back to what it was in the 60s or 70s. It's over. And we're going to have policies that get tougher. And I guess the only way I could say it is how in the world could an economy that is going to grow rapidly have a public that considers Bernie Sanders a viable candidate?
So no,
Yeah.
you're going to waffle on that, or you're not? No strong opinion? Ron, a dissenting view, perhaps?
Well, no, I agree that the president alone can't make any difference, that there's too much built in the whole Washington bureaucracy that no one's going to change it. I do remember when President Carter came in 1977, he came in with the idea that, I'm an outsider, I'm a Southern governor, I can make a big difference. And at that time, I really believed he could. But, as the years went by and now the decades go by, he didn't make much of a difference, and I'm not sure most of the presidents have since then. Particularly in the short run, you can't do very much. It's like trying to turn a ship around in the ocean, and it takes an awful long time. So every time that a new party comes to office and you start getting criticism for what they're doing in terms of how it's impacting the economy, I can't help but think that it's just a spillover from what was going on 2-3 years before, because with all the lags in economic impact, you're halfway through your term as president before you're really able to take credit for or assume the blame for anything that's gone on, because it's all part of the previous
Obama's been president
administration.
8 years. He hasn't taken the blame yet.
No, he hasn't taken. No, and believe me, there's a lot of things that I just think they're just whistling in the wind. I guess that it's too much to expect that anyone's going to make a whole lot of difference.
I would be a little more pessimistic than Ron.
It's tough.
Because
That's
I
not
think,
easy to do.
I think that slow growth that we've got is still just temporary, and the question's going to be the next president, whoever we have, what are they going to be willing to do, or what are they going to try to do to avoid some of the consequences I think are going to happen. And the big difference is going to be, will they accept a recession that clears up a lot of this, or are they going to do something else like impose wage and price controls and try to defer it and make the mess even bigger? Now, I don't know what the answer to that is. The last time we had wage and price controls was under a Republican president, Nixon. Was pretty much an abysmal failure, and a generation has passed, or two, so we've forgotten about that, and we can do that again, I suppose.
I suppose. I would not support wage and price controls.
I think that's something we can agree on, right? So you mentioned the current Fed rate is essentially zero and has been for some period of time. Does that mean that we might expect deflation, especially if there are some shocks to the economy? Dennis, let's start with you.
Well, in fact, the last measured CPI figure was September, and it was negative, slightly negative. And that, of course, is why the Fed's pushing for 2% inflation. They want inflation in the economy so they can keep pushing down the nominal rates of interest, which then generate negative real rates of interest, which is a pretty amazing sort of idea that we would sort of embrace. But we haven't seen the signs in the CPI of inflation. That doesn't mean there aren't prices rising in different places. Inflation is probably the worst measured macroeconomic variable we have. We have one number, doesn't mean anything to anybody. You just sort of react to what you buy and what happens to the price of the goods and services that you buy. So we might have deflation. I think people are afraid of it, and it's, I don't know, maybe you were just raised and your parents were trying to get you to behave by telling you about the fears of deflation. But I don't think it's really that bad. We have what some economists would call good deflation and bad deflation, and good deflation is when the supply of goods and services increases. When we produce more, that drives down prices, and we all probably have smartphones. We aren't waiting for the price to get down to $20 yet. You know, we buy them because they make our lives better. So I think that's kind of a fear that's a little bit irrational, but a lot of people have it, and the Fed certainly seems to be willing to do whatever it can to keep that from happening.
I have it. Irving Fisher wrote a paper in 1932 on debt deflation, and its effect on the economy. And what happens is, imagine your house, except the value keeps on going down. And what happened to the housing market when that happened in this cycle? Nobody bought housing. Nobody could sell housing. Right? Why is anybody going to buy something new if they can wait a year and it's going to be cheaper? So it really affects the overall economy. What Dennis is talking about, yeah, your phone or your TV, that's very, very specific. But if it gets to be economy-wide, it's a disaster, in my opinion. And I think if you went into a recession now, if you had a shock, that's essentially what would happen. The one thing I haven't been able to figure out, it would happen in manufactured goods, but would it happen in services? In other words, would the guy charge you less for a haircut? Is your plumber going to charge you less? Probably not. So I think the risks are mitigated by that. But the manufacturing sector, if we went into a recession now, it would be Katie bar the door on the downside in terms of prices, I think.
Ron?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And the bigger problem is that many times when things get started in one direction or the other, it can take off very quickly because of psychological aspects, in addition to just the economic ramifications. And you could see a downward spiral maybe very quickly in many cases, which could then be like hyperinflation in reverse. And we really don't want to have that. I think the economy that's been closest to that over the 25 years maybe is Japan, where they've kind of been living with this, and you can just see we don't speak about Japan as much anymore as we did 25 years ago because they're not a major player. Well, they're still big, but they're not what they used to be. And I think part of that is because they did experience somewhat of what we've just been talking about.
Interesting. You brought up a memory for me of my dad sitting around the campfire talking about the deflation with a flashlight under his face.
Sure.
And
It's scary, isn't it?
yeah,
Scary stuff.
Scary stuff. Scary stuff. So we mentioned Japan. Elliot, I believe, had a slide that mentioned that China is not that big a player in terms of direct exports to China. They're having a slowdown, although everything is relative. I just returned from visiting with one of our partner schools, and it's in China, and it's hard to believe that there's any sense of a slowdown there with all the construction and commerce that's taking place. But we do see, as somebody said, you know, we're the best-looking house on an ugly block. Yeah. So what is the effect of China, of Europe? Greece has kind of faded a little bit, but what are the effects on, let's talk about Arizona's economy specifically, on some of the global economic factors. Or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's start with China. Don't be fooled. China is just going through an industrial revolution. When you take somebody from rice paddies and you put them in a factory manufacturing some type of junk, that his productivity jumps probably by a factor of 20, maybe more, and that's where their growth is coming from. This is no economic miracle. This is an industrial revolution. Remember Russia and how it was going to overtake us, the Soviet Union, when they went through their industrial revolution? Guess what? When they moved enough people from the farms to the factories, all of a sudden they stopped growing. What a surprise. The same thing's going to happen to China. What is scarier about China is that a lot of their growth is government-induced. If you've been to China, you've seen these ghost cities where they built entire cities, entire huge projects, and there ain't nobody there. That can't last forever. That's simply building capacity. They're borrowing from the future and building it now. So I'm not as up on China as a lot of people in the short run. In the long run, they'll move more people from the farms to the factories, and they'll grow. When they run out of people in 50 years to move, they'll stop growing. Is that going to affect us? Well, yes, but is it dramatic? No. It'll slow things down here. I'd be much more concerned if Europe went into a recession. And that's more likely because when you talk about Europe, you're talking about Germany and England, and who else that has a strong economy? Germany and England and Germany and England.
And that's about it.
And, yeah.
You know, the same thing could be said of Japan again, right? 30, 40 years ago, the idea was they were going to overtake us, and you know, now their auto workers make more than our auto workers. So,
yeah. But in terms of the impact on not only the nation but the state, I mean, if the foreign demand isn't there, and they have weakness in their economy, many times that'll strengthen the U.S. dollar, which then hurts our exports. And it also means that imports are cheaper, so we buy more imported goods, which of course keeps our inflation rate down. But on the other hand, if I were a business person and I saw the weakness in the international markets, particularly in Europe, but in others too, I'm just not going to do as much investing, and I'm just not going to put my money out there. So it, as you said, it delays the recovery, or it puts off what we're likely to have seen, you know, in the past. It's still to come in the future, and you know, it's almost like too little, too late. So I think that we do have to recognize we're in the global economy, and weakness elsewhere is a major part of why we're suffering today.
Yeah, but is it weakness temporary or permanent? In Europe, it's probably permanent. I mean, what policies do they have that are going to change anything? In Japan, it's proved to be permanent. No matter what policies they implemented, it's proved to be permanent. Probably largely because of the psychological factors that you talked about. So who's left? You know, the Singapore, Taiwan. You know, the Southeast Asian countries look like they're doing it, but they're very small, and they certainly don't. You couldn't call them stable, really, and certainly not going to be South America. That's what's scary. There's just, you know, you look around, you say, okay, who's going to pull us out of this? And the answer is, I don't see anybody. That's why I just think things continue to sort of bump along. Yeah. We have changed our policies so dramatically that worldwide that the days of, like I said, the type of growth we had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I think that's over.
And it's complicated by the lower birth rates.
Yes.
That is, the European nations in many cases aren't even replacing themselves anymore with enough births to replace those that are passed away. So you end up with a demographic problem that you can only correct as the next generation comes in and either has more children or there's more of them. And we're going to see the same thing in China, that the number of people in China is already predicted at some point the population is going to start to fall. And if you don't have consumers, you're not going to get enough demand for the goods, and then again you end up with less willingness to invest.
So can we look to what's happened in Japan and what's happening in Europe to see what our future holds? I mean, you've got increasing governmental role in a lot of services. You've got slowed population growth or even negative population growth. I think a lot of our population growth has come from immigration over the last 25, 30 years. That's slowing down. So, I mean, are we going to be like Japan? Are we going to be like most of Europe in the next 20, 25 years?
I have a kid who's married, lives in New York. They want to go explore the world. They're gonna give up their jobs, go around the world, see what's a good place to live. So I made basically 2 lists for them. I said, what countries have a rule of law, and that's a terribly short list, and what companies or what countries score high on economic opportunity. Surprisingly, they're the same list. Okay, and the lists are very short. And if you don't want a cold weather climate, they're very, very short. But the world is changing. It really is. The rule of law is a very fleeting thing in this world, and there are very few countries that really have it. And for you to depend on a country that doesn't have a rule of law to have an economy that's viable, it doesn't work that way. And even here, we're not even in the top 10 on economic opportunity because of a lot of legislative changes that make it very difficult to do the things that used to be easy. So once again, I think we will end up looking like Europe, except with much better demographics. And in that they've got problems in terms of importing labor and Japan has problems importing labor we can't imagine. And then there's the risk of being politically incorrect. America imports labor primarily from countries that have a Judeo-Christian ethic south of the border. Europe imports labor from countries that are primarily Muslim. And Japan doesn't like anybody who's not Japanese, so they're not importing any labor. I don't know what the heck's going to happen there. So in the overall scheme of things, even though we're being negative, the U.S. looks far better than most places in the world. And I believe will continue to be the light in the world, but it's going to be a light that's dimmer than it was.
And I think what you mentioned, that we can look at these other countries, Europe especially, as a harbinger of our future. The big question is, are we going to learn anything from that or not? And that, flip a coin.
Yeah, and I don't want to be too pessimistic, but frankly, in answer to your question, I hope I'm dead before it gets as bad as I think it's going to be.
Oh, jeez.
That's just my thought.
No, go ahead. Be pessimistic. Tell us what that outcome is.
I just don't see things coming back. Elliot is partly right. The light's not going to be very bright, but I think it's going to go out completely. It's just, we're just not going to see the world like we have thought it was going to happen.
Yeah.
So does anybody have a more pessimistic view? It's very interesting to watch, for sure. So we're coming up on our time. I want to ask a question that's particularly relevant to here, to our setting. So one of the issues around employment is there are jobs, there are people that need jobs, but the people that need the jobs can't fill the jobs that are there. We saw it with the construction trades, but you could talk about nursing, you could talk about certain aspects of computer technology, certain types of engineers, even accountants. So what's the role of education in maybe making that light a little bit brighter? I mean, that's been a traditional role that many of us in this room, Dr. Chang, I have first-generation students, we used education to have a more stable economic life than our parents did. So what's the role of education, especially given declining state support and increasing burden on families?
That's a very difficult question, and it's one that's going to become more and more polarized. Is education simply for betterment, intellectual betterment, and nothing else? Or was it like my father I could go, I had 3 choices when I went to college. I could be a doctor, lawyer, or accountant. I got sick at the sight of blood, so doctor was out. I have an accounting degree, and I started law school until my draft board informed me they weren't going to defer me for 3 years, so I went to USC and became an economist. So, you know, what can I tell you? But to me, in today's world, if you don't go to college and come out with a marketable skill, you've got problems. And if you come out with no marketable skill and a whole bunch of student loan debt, you've got problems you're never going to overcome. And that is different than the thinking was in the 70s and 80s, where it was an intellectual exercise. It's not. It's a vocation. And that's one of the things that universities are going to have to decide. I don't know how many majors you have here. At ASU, they've got about 150. I don't know how many of them have marketable jobs after, you know, when they get out. And so there's almost got to be truth in education. How many jobs are available and what do they pay? Because that'll tell you what you can afford. It's a very difficult world in that regard. And why these shortages exist is lack of information. People need to be better informed about where there are jobs, where there are likely to be jobs, and what those jobs pay, so they can make rational decisions about what they do with their life.
And the technology is increasing so quickly that the skills become out of date so fast as well. That you know, I think the universities try very hard to get the students in the right majors and get the jobs, the skills in the people who can fill the jobs. But then the jobs may disappear just as quickly. So you really are always playing catch up, and we need to do that and continue to do that.
I think in terms of having students be motivated to pick the right major and do the right thing, what I see in our students is that more than half don't have a clue why they're here. They're just, you know, the next thing to do is to go to college. And I look at them, I say, well, why don't you get a job for a couple of years and come back, you know, when you're 20, 21, and you'll probably have a better idea of what you want out of college. And you know, that kind of change is not going to happen, but I think that would be the kind of thing that would improve the whole landscape.
We actually see that with our veteran students.
Yes, exactly.
They come back, they're much more focused, much more serious than they might have been in their younger days.
I'll just throw in, my daughter's married an Israeli guy who was in the Israeli Air Force, so I've had an opportunity to meet a lot of Israelis. And boy, I got to tell you, everyone I've met, they are very focused, laser focused, because they were in the military, and it's different than even going in the military here, where if you're sent overseas, your life's in danger. Every day their life's in danger, and they are laser focused on what they want out of life, which I've never seen anything like it.
It's quite remarkable. Well, we want to close it there, but if this isn't enough about the economy for you, on April 6th, we're having our second annual Tribal Economic Outlook Conference right here in the same room, and I would encourage you all to think about attending. It's a very, very interesting, different perspective on some of the economic issues. Let's hear it for our panelists.
Okay.